Alright, so this is probably the last video in this series, and I want to address this very basically, and it's, I mean, real basic, so that you can branch out from this, and like I've spoke to you about digging around, but I wanted to, address the basic issues. One of the first things is very much needed to address is what are you doing as far as your recording, mixing, and mastering music, or your signal processing? What is your setup? What kind of environment are you going to be working in? And try to, that can be very specific about what you need to really work on understanding for your production and what you plan on getting into. So really think about that, because it's, the signal flow of what you're using and what is going to be, your setup is going to be really important about what you really need to focus on more than other aspects. And so really take that into consideration. But really quick, in this last video, I wanted to address these issues, from a very basic, fundamental viewpoint. So when you're recording, mixing, and mastering music, what you need to think about. The first thing is music, composition at some level. What is music, and how is it composed, are its components, and how it goes together. I mean, at some level you're going to want to understand some music and some music theory. So that's the first thing. The second thing is how a DAW and a processor can be an instrument as far as part of composing, because they can very much change the whole way you compose something or put it together musically and theoretically, because of things you may be doing in the DAW with a moving stereo field or different types of processors and different types of effects, all kinds of things that you may do in the DAW that you have to take into consideration as you're composing, or take it into consideration as another composition tool. So that's the second thing. The third thing is sound, timbres, harmonics, complex waveforms, all those kind of things. Anything, what sound is and what those components are of sound as far as audio is, and what, at some level to have an understanding of what's going on there with sound and what sound is. Harmonics, non-harmonics, harmonic distortion, all kinds of things. Get a basic understanding of that. And the next thing is noise and distortion. Noise and distortion has two things, two different ways of looking at it. It's something to be getting rid of, or it's something you want to incorporate into your production. And it's a huge tool. It just is. And you need to understand that it can be a huge tool, but you also need to understand that it can make a mess out of whatever you're doing. So, I mean, it can do both those things. And so you want to have a pretty good understanding of what noises you're going to be dealing with and what distortions you're going to be dealing with in your recording, mixing, and mastering, and how to deal with them, how to use them as tools, and how to get rid of them to better your production. And the next thing is acoustics at some level. Acoustics can be very complex, as far as the room you're recording in and the response, how you place your microphones, all kinds of stuff, that the actual acoustics that can affect lots of things on the exterior of your DAW. And on the interior, when you start messing around with reverbs and delays and all kinds of things, then it starts to affect that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's really hard to know exactly how it affected it, because it's not like you acoustically treated your room when you stuck on this reverb. It's like you've just affected the audio some way acoustically that is going to cause a spatial difference. So anytime you're dealing with spatial, processing and or trying to deal with things about space and, and spatial context, that the acoustics are something you kind of want to look into. Next is electronics for audio engineering. Basics. Have a basic understanding at least of, electronics and audio engineering, and we've addressed that. So, how far you take that, is up to you, but a basic understanding is very pertinent as far as audio engineering, recording, mixing, and mastering music. And coding. Coding would be the next thing. Understanding, what is your DAW is nothing but code, and all the processes are in it. So when you're trying to relate, hardware and software and electronics to what the code is and what the difference is and why it's different, or what it could be different, or how it is somewhere the same when it starts emulating and doing all kinds of stuff, then a basic understanding of coding would be something very, very good for you to look into, because it has a lot of applications that can very much help you in your recording, mixing, and mastering music. So that would be the next thing. The next thing would be signal flow, micro and macro, and we've already talked about this in this series, but your signal flow, micro and macro view of it is very important, and to research it and look into it. The next thing would be MIDI information. You definitely want to have an understanding of what MIDI information and what it's doing. So you definitely want to look into that. The next thing would be connectors, cords, wireless systems, anything that you might be using to send audio signal from one place to another. Anything that's doing that, you want to investigate and understand how it's doing that, why it's doing that, and what, can be good and bad about that, and have a basic understanding of that. The next thing would be instruments and their components. To understand your instrument and what kind of, what its tonal qualities are, its timbres and what's going on it, is very important to understand where to place it in the mix and when not to use it, and how to use it. And the other thing can be their components. Their components as far as like their electronic components, or the coding components of a synthesizer or something, the components of what's happening, and their connections and all that kind of stuff. To have a decent understanding of your instruments, to really look at them and look at a lot of different instruments and what they are, what they're, just what they are and the basics of them. So that's the next one. And then synthesizers. Synthesizers are a huge tool for you helping mixes. You've done everything great, but it needs something. And, and a synthesizer can produce some harmonic content that's going to really help your mix. And you might hardly even notice it in the mix, but you just putting it back there in the background can, make or break a mix big time. And you might not even hardly know it's there, but it just added something to the mix. And, that simple example, to understand what a synthesizer can do, the different types of synthesizers, and what a synthesizer is, its basic components, so that you can really, use that tool well where and when it's needed. And the next thing would be microphones. At some level, understand the different types of microphones, how they're put together, and what they do, and why you would want to use a different microphones on one thing and why you wouldn't want to use a microphone somewhere else can be very pertinent knowledge for you to have, during your production. So you definitely want to look into them. Next would be like preamps, direct boxes, patch bays, things like that. You want to look into that. You want to have a basic understanding of those, even if you might never need a patch bay in your studio, because it's not, I don't need no patch bay in my studio, bro. But, an understanding of what those things do, because you may, and an understanding of what that's doing may open up, all the understanding of all these things can open up other doors and make you change the way you're doing things, because you have a little bit better understanding of what you can do and what pieces of equipment can do different things for you to enhance your signal path or your signal flow, and to do different things to enhance your mix and your recording and your mixing and mastering. So you want to look into those. The next would be mixers, analog and digital mixers. At some level, to understand your analog and digital mixers, what they are and what they do and their components and their connections. Have some understanding of that, at least a basic understanding of what they are. And your DAW mixer also, understand everything it does. And the next thing would be external hardware processors. External hardware processor can be anything from a preamp to a compressor to who knows what, Some people buy racks of that stuff, So having an understanding of external hardware processors and what they do is going to be very pertinent for you to understand, some of those things in the studio for your recording, mixing, and mastering. Whether or not you use them in your signal flow is up to you, but having an understanding of them is going to be to your benefit. The next thing would be your ADC and DACs. At some level, understand the basics of what that piece of hardware is doing, what the heck it's doing, and its components. Next would be speakers and headphones. This is a huge thing because there's a big difference when you're recording, mixing, and mastering, that, when you're mixing, you might be using your nice headphones and your nice monitors, but when it comes out somebody's little cheap earbuds and their cheap, computer monitors and their home speakers, that, that's what you're trying to mix it for. You want to do your mix with your really nice headphones and your monitors or whatever, but when they are listening to it, they might not have the studio that you have to listen to it, to hear it as well as you can. So having an understanding of the difference between the two of those, so that when you're mastering, you take those other pieces of, equipment into consideration for how you're going to master it, what kind of changes you're going to do to the mix to prepare it for those types of formats and those type of environments, so that's another huge one. The next thing is computers and their relation to your processing. To understand what your computer's relation is to your processing signal flow, what it's doing in your processing chain, and what it's, how does it relate to your entire signal flow and components. So that's another thing. The next thing is your DAW and other related software. What does your DAW do? What all can it do? Any other related software that you're using in your production, in your signal flow or editing or anything else, what does it do? What can it do? And understand that very well. Next is audio editing audio. To really understand, what it means to edit a piece of audio, and really look into that so you can really understand, how you edit audio and when you would and why you would. And the next thing would be software processors. Software processors and processing, you kind of got to look at that in the same way as you do hardware processors, their processors and their processing, what the processors are, what they do, and the processing that they do, and understand that very well. To understand what's happening with that piece of software and that processor and exactly what it's doing to your piece of audio and how it works very well. Also, there's another thing as far as signal processing can get very in-depth, and you can get applications like MATLAB or Octave, and it certainly wouldn't hurt you to look into those a little bit. That type of signal processing can be very complex and not look anything like your DAW, but sometimes, it can do things and can help you understand things that you may not understand as well by just looking at your DAW. So that's the next thing. The next thing after that is sound sculpting, being able to take some sound and do something else with it, make it sound different, add harmonic content to it, add distortion and noise, and, what all you might want to do to it, to sculpt it to the way you want it to sound in your production after it's been recorded if you want to do work on it. So that's a huge thing to investigate. The next thing would be formats and formatting. Understand what it means, what a format is, an MP3 or VOG Orbis or whatever that you're dealing with, and actually formatting that audio, formatting for that audio, so that when you're mastering, you understand why you want to do something with the EQ or dither or something else to get that piece of audio ready for that MP3 that's going to be getting played out of somebody's crappy, computer monitors. What do you want to do to that? And while you're in the formatting process, that's a huge thing to understand, and that can a lot of times make or break you. As far as, you do the mixing and you've done everything everybody told you and it sounds great, but then when you go to format it to an MP3 for somebody's crappy speakers, that, it's not that good, because you didn't look at it like you're trying to mix it again after the mixing was done for a different format, and for the formatting process to be done correctly, you have to look at it that way. And you're going to master it down to an MP3, and you're going to listen to it in your crappy earbuds and everything else and see how it sounds, and it doesn't sound that good, so I had to redo the EQ or do some spatial work on it or whatever, dithering, to get it so it sounds as good as it can for that format. All right, the last thing is the performance, the capture, and the timing is everything. So understand that your performance of yourself or the musicians you're working with and making sure their performance is good as it can be, the capture of your or their performance, a good recorded capture, and so it sounds good so that it's nice and clean and done well, is the second thing. The third thing is timing. Make sure that the timing is as good as it can be for that production and whatever you're doing. Focus on that first. The rest of the things will be so much easier if you do that. So I hope that helps you and opens up some doors, and peace, hope, love.